For 80 years, James Carter did something strange. Every night he whispered the same name in his sleep. His family thought it was just an old man's habit, a fading memory from his past. But when his great-granddaughter, Emily, finally asked who Lillian was, she uncovered a heartbreaking love story lost to time. A love that war tore apart, a final letter that shattered his heart, and a truth that had been buried for decades. What she discovered would change everything, revealing a sacrifice so painful it brought their entire family to tears. But the real question remained, after all these years, could James finally find peace? Or was he destined to whisper her name until his final breath? James Carter had lived a long life. At 98 years old, his body had become frail, his hands marked with the passage of time, his movements slow and deliberate. But there was one thing that never changed, one thing that remained with him every night, no matter how many years passed. Every night, without fail, James would whisper the same name in his sleep. Lillian? The soft murmur would escape his lips as he lay in bed, his fingers twitching as if reaching for someone long gone. His family had noticed it for years, his son, his grandchildren. It became a normal part of his nightly routine, something they dismissed as an old man's dream, but none of them ever asked why. It wasn't until his great-granddaughter, Emily, started visiting more often that she began to notice the pattern. She had spent her childhood hearing the stories of her great-grandfather's life, the war, the hardships, the successes. But she had never once heard of a woman named Lillian. One evening, as James sat by the window, lost in thought, Emily finally asked, "Grandpa, who's Lillian?" James' weathered face turned toward her, and for a moment, a deep sadness flickered in his tired eyes. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at his trembling hands as if deciding whether the past was worth revisiting. After a long silence, he sighed. "She was my first love." Emily leaned forward, intrigued. "What happened to her?" James closed his eyes, allowing himself to slip back in time, back to a world that had long since faded. It was 1942. The world was at war, and James was just a young man in his early 20s, full of dreams and ambitions. He had met Lillian at a local diner, where she worked as a waitress. She had the kindest smile, the brightest eyes, and a laugh that could make even the coldest winter feel warm. She was everything to him. They spent their days strolling through the park, sharing milkshakes and dreaming about the future. He promised her the world promised that when the war was over, he'd marry her, and they'd have a little house with a white picket fence. But fate had other plans. James was drafted, and their time together was cut short. The night before he left, they sat on the porch of her family's small home, holding hands beneath the stars. "Promise me something, James," Lillian whispered, her voice trembling. "Anything," he said. "No matter where you are, no matter what happens, don't forget me." He cupped her face gently, pressing his forehead against hers. "Lillian, I could live 100 years, and I'd never forget you." The next morning, he left for war. They wrote letters, beautiful, heartfelt letters filled with love, hope, and longing. Every word brought them closer, even as miles separated them. But one day, the letters stopped coming. Confused and heartbroken, James wrote again and again, but there was no response. Then one day, a letter finally arrived, but it wasn't from Lillian. It was from her mother. It was short, cold, final. "Lillian is gone. Please do not write again." James' heart shattered. He tried to reach out, but every attempt was met with silence. He didn't know what had happened, didn't know if she had moved on, if she had married someone else, or if she simply wanted to forget him. All he knew was that she was gone. The war ended, but James never returned to that small town. He built a life elsewhere, married, had children. He was a good husband, a good father, but deep inside, a part of him had never truly healed. Because every night, for the rest of his life, he dreamed of Lillian. As James finished his story, Emily felt a lump in her throat. She had never seen her great-grandfather so vulnerable, so broken by something that had happened a lifetime ago. "Did you ever try to find her again?" she asked softly. James shook his head. "I didn't see the point. She was gone. She didn't want me anymore." But Emily wasn't convinced. That night, she did something no one in the family had ever thought to do. She searched for Lillian. She combed through old records, newspapers, obituaries. It took days, but eventually she found something. A small article, dated 1944. It was a tragic story. Lillian had been diagnosed with tuberculosis shortly after James left for war. At the time, there was little hope for recovery. Not wanting him to suffer or worry, she had kept her illness a secret. She told her mother to send that letter, the letter that had crushed him, because she didn't want him to hold on to something that could never be. She died in 1944, never knowing that James had never forgotten her. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she read the words over and over again. She had to tell him. The next morning, Emily sat beside James, holding his frail hand. "Grandpa, I found Lillian." His tired eyes widened. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath and told him everything: the illness, the letter, the sacrifice Lillian had made to protect him from pain. For a long time, James said nothing. His lips trembled, his hands shook. And then, for the first time in decades, he wept. Emily wrapped her arms around him as his body trembled with silent sobs. It was as if the weight of 80 years had finally come crashing down on him: the heartbreak, the loneliness, the unanswered questions. She didn't forget me?" he whispered. "No, Grandpa," Emily said. "She loved you until the very end." A sad, broken smile touched James' lips. He closed his eyes, whispering her name one last time. "Lillian." That night, for the first time in 80 years, James slept peacefully. And when he passed away in his sleep, his family wasn't surprised to see a soft smile on his lips. In his dreams, James found himself young again, standing in the golden glow of a summer afternoon. There she was, just as he remembered her: laughter carried by the wind, her arms open, waiting for him. He ran to her, his heart light, free from the burden of years spent missing her. As the morning sun painted the sky, James took his final breath. His family found him with a soft smile on his lips, as if he had finally reunited with the love he had called for in his sleep all those years. And in that quiet moment, they knew he had finally found his way back to her. Because after 8 long decades, he had finally found the closure he had been waiting for. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally with her again.